If you ask the average person today what the manned space program is, you'll hear things like the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle. We see astronauts talking via satellite to high school students when performing experiments in space on long-term stays. Barring a tragedy, few of us paid attention to the shuttle launches. And once the investigations were finished, they were out of the news cycle again. Those of us with shiny adult hair remember another time, a time of Apollo. On a cold December night in 1972, I remember standing outside my home in Fort Lauderdale and watching Apollo 17 take our last manned mission to the moon. 3 years earlier, we had gathered around the black and white television in the den to watch Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon from Apollo 11. And when I was in my medical residency, we would go to the theater to learn about the right stuff of the Mercury 7. But between the heroic Mercury astronauts, the moon landings, the shuttle disasters, and the high school lessons, somebody had to teach us how to live and work in space. The 10 manned missions that taught us how to maneuver in orbit, to walk in space, to rendezvous and to dock. All the routine skills and the ability to live up to 8 to 10 days in orbit. Not only learning to do the task, but training the men that would later go on to land on the moon in Apollo and command the space shuttles. This series is about Project Gemini. We'll go over each of the missions, profile the crews, discuss what they did and what they learned. It seems as though history has forgotten them, but they are the ones that helped get us to the moon. And the triumph of the shuttle and the ISS was built upon the foundation they carefully laid in the mid-60s. So join me now as we review the two-man cruise of Gemini, a bridge between Mercury and Apollo. The initial Gemini launches were basically designed to test out the systems. With Gemini 5, it was time to get to work in space. The planned 8-day flight would put America back into the record books. Gemini 5 would use a new hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell, alleviating the need for heavy batteries like the ones used on previous space flights. In addition to testing the maneuver capabilities of the spacecraft and the fuel cell, they conducted 17 scientific experiments while in flight. They also dealt with the difficult problem of sleeping in space. Initially, they tried to sleep in shifts. However, they found that when one astronaut was awake, somebody was always talking to them on the radio, waking up the other one. Eventually, they decided to work, eat, and sleep on the same schedule, relying on mission control to keep watch over them. Mercury veteran Gordon Cooper was in command of the mission. Cooper had been with the Marines during World War II. In 1949, he was commissioned into the Army and immediately transferred to the Air Force. Trained as a fighter pilot, he was selected for test pilot school in 1956 and was one of the original Mercury 7 in 1959. In May 1963, he flew the final Mercury mission, logging 22 orbits of the Earth. As interesting as Gordon Cooper was, Pete Conrad may actually be more so. Conrad had been in the evaluation group for the Mercury 7. A naval test pilot, he was all up for the idea of being an astronaut, but when it came to the medical tests, he drew the line. Like many of his fellow candidates, Conrad felt the medical testing was both invasive and embarrassing. Unlike his fellow candidates who stoically submitted to the testing, Conrad began to rebel. When ordered to provide yet another stool sample for the lab, he gift-wrapped it and put a large red ribbon on it before he dropped it off. This continued to escalate until the point that he decided he was going to drop out of the program. He did so by delivering his own enema bag onto the desk of the commanding officer of the clinic. Pete Conrad was subsequently accepted in astronaut class number 2. Gemini 5 was launched April 21, 1965. Let's have a look at news clips from the air.
This is Gemini Launch Control, now T-minus 4 minutes and 15 seconds and counting. Astronauts Cooper and Conrad still reporting the status of their spacecraft as go. We continue our checks in the blockhouse. We have now tied in the launch vehicle, the spacecraft, the control center in Houston, and the Air Force Eastern Test Range. All is go at the present time, now coming up on 3 minutes and 50 seconds and counting. This is Gemini Launch Launch Control.
Getting into the final minutes before this launch. Astronauts in perfect condition, cheery, as you saw a moment ago. Big smiles as they were seen both leaving their sleeping quarters over on Merritt Island, and as they got suited up, and as they actually got into the spacecraft.
3 minutes and 22 seconds and counting. We're checking with a computer update. This is the spacecraft computer to ensure that it is synchronized for the launch.
We've got just 3 minutes and 2 seconds to go.
T-minus 3 minutes and counting. T-minus 3.
The voice you hear coming in is Jack King, the voice of Launch Control at Cape Kennedy. Immediately after launch, the spokesman will be Paul Haney from the Mission Control Center at Houston, Texas. Houston actually controls this mission.
Launch Control, now T-minus 2 minutes, 24 seconds and counting. We have just received a go from the range. The range is cleared to launch.
Clearance has come from the range for launch.
This is Gemini Launch Control, T-minus 2 minutes and counting. We have confirmation that our computer has been updated in the spacecraft. All systems still go on the Gemini 5 countdown.
I have to get out of here. 1 minute, 45 seconds to launch.
Gemini Launch Control, T-minus 1 minute and 30 seconds and counting. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. All systems still looking good. As we approach the final seconds of the countdown, the Titan II launch vehicle will ignite. The 2 engines in the first stage booster will ignite as we reach 0 in the countdown. 3 seconds later, after numerous parameters have been checked, the launch vehicle will be released. We will have liftoff some 3 seconds after ignition. Now 1 minute and counting. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. T-minus 35 seconds. T-minus 25 seconds. We're now primarily on an automatic sequence in the blockhouse, monitoring the final functions as they occur. T-minus 15. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. We're off on the hour.
Looks good, straight as an arrow.
Clock started and the roll program is initiated. Gordon Cooper reports.
They should be pitching now. They're 24,000 feet, 2,400
Roll
feet.
program is complete. Pitch program has been initiated.
This is one of the Gemini fuel cells. These devices are essential for space exploration because in addition to creating electrical power, they also generate drinking water.
So here's how the cell works. Hydrogen gas is fed into a chamber on one side so that hydrogen molecules can permeate through the electrode. On the other side, oxygen permeates this electrode. In the centre is the electrolyte, a weak solution of potassium hydroxide. Although only a millimetre thick, the electrodes are almost impervious to liquids. They provide an interface between the electrolyte and the gases and act as catalysts for the half reactions. At this electrode, hydrogen, the reductant, reacts with hydroxide ions to form water. As this happens, electrons are released and flow into the external circuit. At this electrode, oxygen, a strong oxidant, grabs electrons from the external circuit and reacts with water to form hydroxide ions.
Mission Commander Gordon Cooper never flew again in space, retiring from NASA in 1970. He died in 2004, and a portion of his ashes were sent to space. Pete Conrad went on to command Gemini 11, at only 5'6" when he stepped on the surface of the moon as commander of Apollo 12. Pete Conrad joked that may have been a small one for Neil, but it was a long one for me. Conrad's final mission to space was Skylab 2, where he served as commander. He retired from NASA and died in 1999. While our quest for space was a quest for discovery, I suspect that many people that watch YouTube nowadays don't remember the space race, the Cold War, or in some cases, even the Soviet Union. Just to get a little better feel of the national importance of the Gemini mission, let's have a listen to one of the newsreels of the time. Something as simple as recovering the spacecraft. Listen between the lines and see how this is repackaged in the terms of the Cold War. Thank you for taking a few minutes to stop by, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the series. This is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel.
Champlain proceeds at 30 knots, and 2 hours after taking the astronauts aboard, comes alongside the floating Gemini 5. The tiny spacecraft and its crew have set 5 world records. Through them, the United States has chalked up the longest flight in space, far topping Russian cosmonaut Valery Bykovsky's 119 hours of 2 years ago. It has amassed the greatest total of man-hours in space, nearly 640, as against the Russians' 507. This country can claim the longest multi-manned flight, the most revolutions around the Earth, and with its 9 to the Soviets' 8, the most manned flights in space.
Just in case anybody needs to borrow one, there's a ruler.
The capsule, with its priceless records, is carefully lifted aboard the carrier. The scorched heat shield shows the searing effects of re-entry. The capsule began its descent north of Hawaii, ending off Bermuda. Sharks are a hazard outer space doesn't offer. The capsule will be given rigorous examination for guidance in forthcoming space projects. Next scheduled is Gemini 6, which will be aloft only 2 days, but will try an all-important meeting and hooking up with an Agena rocket for 9 orbits. The astronauts come to take another look at their cramped little home in space. They too were to have rendezvoused with a satellite the Gemini itself put into space, but could not because of one of the power difficulties they experienced. This, however, was the only one of the 17 scientific experiments they planned that was not accomplished. After Gemini 6, there will be 12 to 14-day Gemini 7, probably in February. After 5 more Gemini flights, the U.S. space program will really take off into the Apollo program, whose climax will be the big shot to the moon. It's tentatively scheduled for 1969, but speedy development of the mighty Saturn V booster rocket could possibly move this up to 1968.
I find this next scene interesting. Even though we had telemetry of them from launch to splashdown, some people still required further proof.
2 $1 bills are produced as evidence that flyers Cooper and Conrad, who received them before taking off, are really themselves and not interlopers who sneaked into the capsule in space. This certifies their record to the International Aeronautics Foundation. Now it's time to relax. There's a band playing the kind of music they'd requested above, and a nice rich cake to cut. For their first meal after 8 days of capsule fare, the astronauts were allowed to eat almost anything they wanted. But after this, there will be 11 days of strict medical examination and diet. To astronauts Cooper and Conrad, it can be said, mission gloriously accomplished.